So, good evening, everybody. For those of you who were here with us last time, welcome back. And for those of you joining for the first time, welcome to Skills for Solidarity. My name's Anna. I'm the program coordinator for Skills for Solidarity, and I'll be moderating and facilitating the panel that we have lined up this evening. We have a great list of panelists with us. I'll introduce them in a moment, but just want to give a few words of intro before we get started. So, our team has been really delighted to see the response to the program so far. We had about 400 people joining us live last time, and then over 1,000 of you have caught up afterwards. So it's so thrilling to us that so many people from coast to coast to coast are wanting to have this conversation. So welcome back, and we're happy you're here to join us. As I mentioned last time, I won't be speaking very much this panel, but I do just have a few quick updates before we jump into our panelists. So for those of you who haven't checked out the forum yet on the Skills for Solidarity website, I really encourage you to do so. There are some great conversations that have started, but they'd really benefit from some more input. I've put a few questions up there that came directly out of the module workbook for this panel, so they're ready for you to dive in and start having conversations right after the panel wraps up this evening. Also, if you would like to update your username in order to keep your email address private on the panel, you can just post in the forum and then click on the little avatar beside your post, and it'll give you the option to edit your display name. So feel free to do that if you want to protect the privacy of your email. Many of you asked last time if the workbook could be up a little bit earlier, so we've got the workbook up on the Module 2 page already, and you can head over there right away or after the panel to download it. Our panelists have put together a really incredible set of questions this time, so I hope they spur lots of really interesting thinking. Otherwise, the only other note for me is to keep checking the announcements page. I've been posting lots on there. There's some great initiatives going on across the country that I'm hoping to promote. There's ways to help promote the program, and there's updates on the panel as we move forward. So that's all my little comments. So let's jump into this week. We started this program off with storytelling 3 weeks ago, and now we are going to link those stories to some of the policies and practices and systems that have created them. So the focus this time around is to more deeply understand our shared history on this land. We have 4 incredible panelists joining us this evening. Robina Thomas, Victoria Freeman, Jessie Thistle, and Ed Bianchi. And I'll introduce you to them more fully before they speak. We'll follow a really similar format to last time, so if you're with us, it's the same thing. We'll have each panelist speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. If you do have a question, you can send us an email at skillsforsolidarity@leadnow.ca or post a tweet using #skills4solidarity. So that's emailing us at skillsforsolidarity@leadnow.ca or tweeting at #skillsforsolidarity. And all that info should be on the page where you're watching the panel right now in case you forget. Start sending those in right away. I have an amazing crew from Leadnow, Joel, Amara, and Logan, who are ready to receive your questions and sort through them and pass them on to me so that I can get them to our panelists. I also have Sana and Stefan from the Leadnow team in the background making sure all the tech runs smoothly tonight, so lots of gratitude for these folks for helping us out. So just a heads up that similar to last time, obviously in an hour and a half, we're not going to be able to cover everything in this panel. It won't be a comprehensive overview of history, but rather our panelists are bringing in pieces of the history that resonate with them so we can start piecing together this bigger story of what's been happening on this land. They're going to start highlighting some of the policies and practices that have been in place and have shaped the relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples on this land we now call Canada. However, we all have an ongoing responsibility to continue to explore this history, get other perspectives that might not be represented on this panel, and to hear more stories. So really, this is just the beginning. We're going to start piecing together stories, policies, practices, systems to start getting a broader understanding of what's been going on. So our first panelist this evening, I'm very excited to introduce, is Robina Thomas, whose traditional name is Qualsiamat. Robina is a member of the Liaxin First Nation, and she is also an associate professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Victoria. She holds the interim position of co-chair of the First Peoples House at UVic and has extensive experience in the field of Indigenous studies. Her master's thesis focused on Cooper Island residential schools, and her PhD dissertation focused on Indigenous women and leadership. Her research interests really focus on Indigenous women and children, residential schools and the impact of them, storytelling, community engagement, and anti-colonial and anti-racist practices as a way of life. So I will hand it over to you, Rubina. I'm very excited that you're joining us tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Haichka, thank you, Anna. Aitsapualiat, Antha Qualtsiamat, Tanits and Lyaxans, the name Ostolo. Haichka Laquangan, with Thapsik Mastimo. Haichka Snanawas, Haichka Anna, and still Skills for Solidarity, Haitsapka. So in my very broken Hulkamilam, I've told you that my name is Qualtsiamat, my English name is Rubina Thomas. I've told you that I'm a member of Lyaxan First Nation, but I'm a member of Lyaxan First Nation because I was married before 1985, before the Indian Act changed. And so through my grandmother, I would have belonged to Nanaimo First Nations, Nanaimo, or through my grandfather to the Stolo territory in Chilliwack area. I've thanked the Esquimalt and Songhees people from Victoria for allowing me to live, learn in their traditional territory. But I've also acknowledged Snanawas, or the Nanoose people, because that's whose traditional territory I'm on today in Parksville. And I've thanked Skills for Solidarity and Anna for inviting me to do this work, and thanked you all for joining me. So, you know, I've spent the last week or so trying to decide where to even begin and how to discuss a shared history and what that would mean, what a shared history between Indigenous nations and the Canadian state would actually look like, and how to begin this conversation. My struggle, I guess, is that I don't believe that there is a shared history in Canada. And I certainly, from my reflection on my K-12 education, I didn't see any of my Indigenous ways of knowing or being reflected in any of that work. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by trying to read something on the side. So what do I want to say? When I reflected on what I learned in K-12, it was very little. And what it certainly didn't reflect anything about colonization. If anything, it depicted a grand narrative of Canada as a peacekeeping, loving, feel-good kind of country. And so you would think that with that narrative, that is how we would see it. But I would argue that for Indigenous people, we don't feel reflected in that narrative. As a social work educator, I find that the majority of the settler students that come into my classrooms say, Rubina, we don't know this history. Why don't I understand residential schools? Why don't I know about child welfare? Why don't I know about the 60s scoop? Why don't I understand colonization? And so this is where I think we need to start to have our conversation today. So where to from here? So despite what we do or do not know through public education, we all seem to have some notions of what it means to be an Indigenous person, or what Indigenous people in Canada are, or a little snippet of what that means. Whether that just means that we understand some of the stereotypes or know some of the stereotypes, we have some knowledge of what that is. And so today, what I really thought would be most important was to look at socialization and internalization, and from there focus on 3 snippets of history where I will try illustrate and problematize colonization and what we know or what we don't know. When I teach this work, one of the things that I try really hard to do is not to individualize it and say, you know, I can't believe you don't know this, because I understand that I didn't learn any of what I know about colonization through my public education, nor did I actually when I went to university. But what I do think is that as Canadians and as adults, it is now our responsibility. And if we truly believe in skills for solidarity, or being allies, any of those things, then I think now it's our responsibility to learn. In this presentation, one of the things I will not do is discuss Indigenous problems or Indigenous issues or any of those from that perspective, because the issues that Indigenous people face in Canada today is a direct result of Canadian policies and practices. And they, as such, require Canadian solutions. And I think this is where we start to understand colonization and start to look at what a shared history might actually look like for us all. Over the years, I get asked a lot, how come we don't know this? What can I do about it? I'm really angry. I just don't know where to go with this. And I think those are really, really good questions. But what I do know is that I'm certainly not the one to begin to answer those questions, because I'm not sure exactly what people know and what they don't know. One of my all-time favorite writers is Lee Miracle, and she has an article that's titled An Infinite Number of Paths to the Center. And in that article, she's having a conversation with a white settler friend of hers named Janice, and they're discussing the role of white people as allies, as advocates. And Janice is asking about, the different ways of being a role, and Lee states she can't answer Janice's particular question because I'm not undoing the dilemma you've been caught in. And I think that this is really what we need to understand is, what is our particular dilemma? What do we know? What don't we know? And only you yourselves know exactly where to begin and how this work should do. But one of the really important things that Lee Miracle discusses in this article is unbecoming and becoming. And when she's talking about becoming, she's talking about how we've been socialized, and through our socialization, what we've internalized. And in that, it's how we see the world. And so she talks about how those ways inform our ways of knowing and being. And so if we've been socialized to believe the stereotypes of Indigenous people, and like I already said, I'm not going to reiterate any of those, I'm sure that many of you know a lot of them or most of them, then we naturally see them in a particular way. And I'll give you an example here of the impact, I think, of socialization and internalization. My son, Dylan, was in grade 2 in a public school in Victoria. The first time he came home crying and said to me, "Mom, these girls said I couldn't play with them because I was nothing but a dirty Indian." And I mean, from a mother's perspective, I can go on and tell you a whole story about how painful that was. But my point being, I don't think that by the age of 6 or 7, anyone had sat those little girls down and said, this is what you believe about Indigenous people, this is how you treat them, and no one had told them, you're more powerful than them, you have more privilege than them. But they had been socialized already by that young age to know that Dylan was, in their eyes, perceived to be less than. And so I think that those young girls, like Lee Miracle says, those young girls had witnessed this at their, when they were having dinner with the people sitting around the dinner table with them, in all of the different places they had been, on the bus, listening to music, watching TV, all of those things that we do. They had naturally started to internalize that. And she goes on to say that becoming a racist or becoming self-racist is painless, but unbecoming is excruciatingly painful. And I think that that's what I want us to consider today as we have this conversation, is that it is through these unspoken ways of knowing and being that we come to be in the world. And we rarely ever spend any time to stop and reflect on, how do I know what I know? And nor do we have time to examine whether or not how we are in the world is based in truth and fact, or whether it's based on a grand narrative of what it is to be a Canadian in Canada. So whose responsibility is it to help folks unbecome the racism and the privilege that they've internalized? And I'm certainly there to support people when they begin a journey like this, but it's not a journey I can force anyone to begin. So it really starts with us looking deep within our own spirits, within our own souls, to try, say, what do I know? What is my dilemma? What's my specific dilemma about how I see the world? And where is it that I struggle to work across difference? And I think that that's really, really important for us. And then I would go as far to say that really, truly a part of healing is unbecoming in the ways that we need to unbecome. And one of the things Lee Miracle talks about in her article is that unbecoming a racist is excruciating, but also unbecoming the racism that people have internalized is excruciatingly painful. And when I went through life, I had internalized a lot of racism, one being that I would never graduate from high school, one being that I would never, do certain things in my life. And I remember when I got my social work degree, my first degree, thinking that somehow I'd managed to dupe everybody and that I didn't really deserve to have a degree. And I really upset me when I realized that as I was convocating and walking across the stage, that I had doubted myself. And that was the level of racism that I had internalized. And so when we're talking about unbecoming, for folks to realize that many of us are also unbecoming at the same time, many of us being Indigenous people. And so she talks about this unbecoming like climbing a mountain, and we take a few steps up and we slip, and we take a few more steps up and we slip. But she says, imagine the conversation we will have when we both get to the top of the mountain and we're looking each other in the eyes, and we've become all of that shit that we've internalized for so many years, and we really look at each other as equals, eye to eye. And I think that that's some of the things that we really need to think about. I'm going to switch a little bit now to talk about a couple of things that are near and dear to my heart. And when I teach, I'm trying to make sure I'm not taking up too much time here. When I teach, three of the things that I talk about that we really need to understand if we're going to understand the history of Indigenous people, and there's many things, but one of them is residential schools, and understanding that residential schools were legislated in 1920, they were law, and that children were legally removed from their families and communities and forced to attend a Christian-based school. They were absolute policies of assimilation or genocide. Duncan Campbell Scott stated that we're going to continue till there's not an Indian problem, and that was the full purpose of residential schools, and that officials knew of the abuse that was taking place in those institutions and failed to protect the children. And I think that's really important to understand the setting of the history in Canada. The next quick policy I want to highlight is child welfare. In 1951, the provincial government was given jurisdiction to enter reserve lands to fulfill their mandate to protect children, to fulfill child protection services. However, so many children were apprehended and so many children were put up for adoption that we've got a time now that's coined the 60s scoop, where children were literally scooped out of our communities and forced, and many of them adopted out of, not just out of our communities, but even out of the country. And there's more Indigenous children in care today than there was at the height of children in residential schools. There's upwards of 50% of the children in care are Indigenous. We make up about 4% of the Canadian population. And then the last thing I want to focus on is Indigenous women. And I think it was 1850, was the first time the Indian Act defined who was an Indian and who wasn't an Indian. And at that time, they claimed that Indian women who married white men would lose their status, but women who married Indian men would gain their status. And you can see that this policy focused on women. It focused on taking the status from women. And naturally, who are the childbearers in the communities? It's the women. So you can tell, from these three policies, And the reason I chose these three is because you can tell that this was very, very thoughtful and purposeful part of the Indian Act. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't that it was good intentions gone bad. They were very, very thoughtful. Indigenous women were revered for their ability to give life. They were, as such, they were the carriers' cultures, and they were carriers of culture and tradition, and they were just really, really respected for that. Today, there's over 1,000 Indigenous women across Canada that are missing and assumed dead, and we don't have an outcry over this. And it shocks me when the Picton case was blown apart, that for a few months we were kind of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened, and then it just kind of disappeared. Except for any of us that might have family on the downtown east side, then of course that to me is a reality. I had a sister there for many years. I never forget the downtown east side. I never forget Picton. I never forget these 1,000 women who are mothers, sisters, grandmothers, daughters. And today, Indigenous women continue to be givers of life and carriers of culture. And I'm going to end with an old Cherokee proverb that you've probably all heard, but I think that it's so, so fitting for us to contemplate today. A nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. Then it is done, no matter how brave its warriors or strong its weapons. And I thank you for listening to me today, and am looking forward to any questions or comments you have. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Robina. I'm really grateful that you opened the panel in that way of talking about how we're socialized into these ways of thinking and knowing and being in the world, and then starting to draw us into some of the policies and practices that have shaped what we see going on around us. And I know that as we move forward into the remaining three panelists, what Robina touched on here is just going to continue to open and open and open. If there are things that are referred to in any of the talks that the panelists are giving that you'd like more information about, just send a question our way. If you're like, oh, I'd like to hear more about how the Indian Act impacted women, or any more detail on residential schools or whatever it might be, then like I said last time, yeah, the range of questions that we're open to here tonight is really broad. So don't hold back from asking those ones that you think lots of people already know or that you should know, because as Robina just highlighted to us, this stuff isn't taught to us, and it's not taught to us for a reason. It's meant to be kept quiet. So let's break that open and just say, yeah, I don't know this. Can you please fill me in a bit more? So send them our way, and that would be great. So the next panelist that we have with us this evening is Victoria Freeman. So Victoria is a Canadian of British settler heritage and the author of Distant Relations: How My Ancestors Colonized North America. As an activist, community organizer, writer, public speaker, academic historian, and teacher, she seeks to educate herself and facilitate learning for others on decolonization and reconciliation in Canada. She's launching a new course called Decolonizing Canada in the Canadian Studies program at Glendon College in York, and teaches the history of Indigenous people in Canada in the York History Department. Her 2010 PhD dissertation was called Toronto Has No History: Indigeneity, Settler Colonialism, and Historical Memory in Canada's Largest City, and focused on the changing historical memory of the Indigenous past of that community of Toronto. She's a member of First Story Toronto, which is a community-based history project at the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto, and has been involved in the development of the First Story smartphone app, which is on the Indigenous history of Toronto, as well as an intergenerational oral transmission project called Indigenous Women, Memory and Power in Toronto, 1960 and 1990. At the U of T, she co-developed and co-taught an Aboriginal Studies course called The Politics of Process of Reconciliation with the Stolo writer and teacher Lee Miracle, which we just had Robina speaking about, so lots of nice overlap there. Victoria was also a member of the organizing committee for the Meeting Place Truth and Reconciliation Toronto 2012, which was organized by Toronto Council Fire Native Cultural Centre in collaboration with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and other organizations, and the founder of Turning Point Native Peoples and Newcomers, an online website for intercultural dialogue and learning. And she was part of Eighth Fire, which was a CBC television documentary series on reconciliation, which you can find on the CBC website. So she keeps herself very busy, as do all of our panelists. I'm really delighted to have you here, Victoria. I will hand it over to you, and we will continue diving into this shared history of ours.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this Skills for Solidarity session. I want to begin by telling you that I'm talking to you from Montreal, and I want to acknowledge that I'm on Indigenous land. I want to acknowledge particularly the Mohawks, the Haudenosaunee peoples. I was born in Ottawa on Algonquin territory, and I now live in Toronto. Where I acknowledge the long presence of the Mississaugas of New Credit, other Anishinaabe peoples, the Senecas and other Haudenosaunee, and the Wendats, and other peoples going back about 12,000 years. So I'm going to start today by talking a little theoretically or conceptually at first about settler colonialism. What is this system that we're living in? And then I will talk more about what history has to do with it, why it's important to learn this history, how we can learn this history, and talk a little bit about my own experience trying to do that. So I'm going to start with this term settler colonialism, which you may have heard. What is settler colonialism? I understand it, academics describe it as a process by which one people comes, basically invades another country, takes over the land, and moves in for their own benefit. And this is a process that's taken place in many countries around the world. Canada is one, the United States is another, New Zealand, Australia, other countries in South America, Central America, and other parts of the world. It's different from some other kinds of colonialism where colonizers basically used Indigenous labor to extract resources from the land, but didn't move en masse and take over the territory in quite the same way. And one of the things that's different about settler colonialism from other forms of colonialism is that in other cases, as many developing countries have regained their political independence, at least to some degree, in those cases, the colonizers left the country. But in a country like Canada, in settler colonial societies, for the most part, the settlers become the majority and are not likely to leave en masse. So if that's the case, what is the path to decolonization in those circumstances? Will such a country or such a society always remain a settler colonial society that only benefits some of the people? And one of the essential dynamics of settler colonialism is that in taking the land is the central issue, not the labor of the Indigenous people. And in the process of taking over the land, Indigenous people are either eliminated in one way or another or absorbed through assimilation. And in Canada, both of those processes have happened. Indigenous people have been pushed to the margins, pushed off most of the land, and then also attempts have been made to assimilate them. One of the things that more recent scholars of settler colonialism have discussed, and particularly Patrick Wolfe and Lorenzo Veracini are two people who have really thought a lot about what settler colonialism is. One of the things that they've said is that settler colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. And I think that's very important for us to understand. It's true that colonization began 500 or so years ago in North America, but it wasn't something that just happened in the past. And it's not just a series of events. It has become the structure of the country, the political and the economic and the social structure of the country. And for that reason, it can be perpetuated. It will be perpetuated unless we act to change it. It kind of runs by itself in a lot of ways. So another thing about settler colonialism is that the initial settlers bring in and impose their own cultural values and their own governance on the new territory. And it is all structured for their benefit and not for the benefit of Indigenous peoples. And then later newcomers are absorbed into the society that the initial settlers create. Some of those later newcomers did not come of their own free will. For example, people who were brought from Africa to North America as slaves, people from South Asia who came to the Americas as indentured servants, and even immigrants, later immigrants, some of whom were very racialized, some of whom were very poor. People ended up in North America. The settler peoples and the other newcomers came to North America for many different reasons. But for immigrants, the idea was that in North America they could build a better life. And part of that was because they believed they could have their own land. And that has a lot to do with the history of land ownership and property and political power in other countries, and it's part of the reason that a lot of people ended up here. But what was never acknowledged was that they were taking other people's land. So when we think about, okay, well, if that's the situation, how do we decolonize? I'd say two things, that decolonization depends on the efforts of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And I think non-Indigenous people have to recognize that there's a part of decolonization that they cannot do, and that's the work of Indigenous people to restore, rebuild their own cultures and societies. It's not our job as non-Indigenous people to do that. Our role, as I see it, is twofold. It's how do we support the work that Indigenous peoples must do for themselves on the one hand, and how do we decolonize ourselves so that we don't perpetuate the same old patterns and the same ways of thinking that we've inherited from previous generations. So how do we transform our own thinking? And how do we come to understand how we are part of the colonial process? I think there are three ways of looking at history and how it can help us, how an understanding of history can help us decolonize. First of all, as I said, there are many old patterns and attitudes that have been repeated over generations since colonizers first came to North America. And history can help us recognize those. And in this, I'd say it's very important to have an understanding of the history of Canada and North America generally, to understand some of those general patterns of interaction, and especially of interactions between governments and Indigenous peoples. Then I think it's very important to learn the history of where you actually live. And that's because there are many different histories in different parts of Canada. Sometimes you hear the phrase, we're all treaty people, but in fact, that's not true. Most Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, for example, never signed treaties. Their relationship to the government and to non-Indigenous citizens of Canada is somewhat different as a result. And the power dynamics, the options open to them in terms of how they can move forward are different from peoples who sign treaties. There are some patterns that are the same, some issues that are very broad, and Robina mentioned some of those. And there are other things that are very specific to the particular area. I think it's very important to understand the history of where you are actually living now, because that can give you insight into the local struggles of Indigenous peoples and how best to support them. Another thing about learning that broader history is to understand that the history of interaction in Canada is not just the work, the history of colonization is not just the work of governments, and it's not just the work of some extremely bigoted or racist people. Colonization happened and is perpetuated now through the actions and choices of ordinary people, of ordinary non-Indigenous people, in all kinds of situations. And that has always been the case. Governments may have set some of the parameters, but other non-Indigenous peoples either vote in their governments, move on to lands taken by Indigenous peoples, or support the extraction of resources that are on Indigenous lands. So I think, first of all, learning that history of Canada generally and our own territory is important. The other process I see is very crucial is understanding your own history, how you got here if you're a non-Indigenous person, what you learned in your family about Indigenous people and about the history here. Learning whose land you came to and why you know that or don't know that. And also, where in the world was your connection to land? If you came from other countries, did you have a strong connection to land somewhere else? So all of us have been shaped by colonization, sometimes in multiple ways, as both colonizers or colonized. Even people like myself with British heritage have a history where the British were colonized multiple times, starting with the Roman colonization of Britain. How did those events affect the perceptions of British people? These are all questions to ask ourselves. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about my own experience in looking at my own family history, which I knew nothing about before I started doing the research that eventually led to my book, Distant Relations. I'd just heard that my family came in the potato famine from Ireland in 1846. But in fact, other branches of my family had been here in North America for many more generations, and were in fact among the first wave of colonizers to North America. And I say this not to indigenize myself, like I've been here longer than you have, or to say that because I've been here so long, I have more claim to the land. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that in my case, I learned that my family has been involved in the colonization of North America for a very long time. And I had to try to understand my own connection to that history and to my ancestors. Was I responsible for what my ancestors did? And I came to understand that I felt a kind of amorphous guilt for what they had done, for the various roles that they played. Some of them were missionaries, some of them were fur traders, some of them were involved in treaty making, some of them just moved on to Indigenous people's land that had been acquired under very dubious circumstances. Some of them participated in wars of genocide and intercolonial wars. All of that history is part of what made me, and part of what gave me the privileges and benefits that I have in Canada. So what I found as I studied that history was that I came to understand more of the justifications that my ancestors had in making the choices that they did. And also, I came to understand that I was not responsible for what they had done, although I had inherited both the material benefits and the attitudes from them that were racist and perpetuated colonialism. So doing that research helped me to unsettle myself and unpack a lot of those attitudes, to understand where that racial attitude of racial superiority came from, or religious superiority. So I do that research not to condemn my ancestors, but to own them, and to understand that for me now, it's what I do in the present that really counts. I'm not accountable for what they did in the past. At the same time, learning that history changed my relations with Indigenous people very fundamentally, because I was no longer denying that history or afraid of learning about it. I went through the shame and the pain of it, and also the mourning. I think I understood that what I felt was actually grief for all the devastation that happened, even more than guilt, and that grief is something we can share. Okay, so I think I'll stop there and just say that working through all the various feelings that we have about this history and about our implication in colonialism in the present is very difficult. And yet, that's what will make us become allies that Indigenous people can trust. If we can end the denial that we have and the avoidance that we have, and actually acknowledge what the past has been and how it impacts on the present. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Victoria. And thanks for really centering a theme which I think we've been talking about since this program began last time, around the responsibility on those of us that are settlers to start with ourselves and to start with the land that we're on, and to recognize and acknowledge the history that is there, because everywhere across this land things have looked slightly different, and starting local with what's happened on that piece of land where we are is a really nice entryway in for folks if at times this history or what we're talking about seems so large and overwhelming and so much to understand. Starting at a local level, building relationships, understanding what's happened, understanding how you ended up there can be a really lovely way to start learning this and recognizing how you're connected to it. So thank you for what you've offered us tonight. I'm going to keep us moving forward to our next panelist, who is Jesse Thistle. So Jesse is a Michif or Métis man from Saskatchewan. He's the current president of the Aboriginal Students Association at York University, and is an active member of York U's Powwow Committee. He's also a member of York's Circle of Scholars for 2 years running and ranks among the top 55 students out of a student body of 50,000. His community work involves understanding and healing the intergenerational trauma that has come to dominate Aboriginal society in contemporary times as a result of this settler state colonialism that we've been hearing about this evening. He does this by applying a historical lens on past trauma and understanding how they affect modern day populations. And specifically, his research focuses on Métis families in the Parkland belt of northern Saskatchewan who descend from Métis veterans of the 1885 resistance at Batoche. Excuse my mispronunciation. If that's wrong, you can correct me, Jesse. His findings have been presented at numerous conferences where it's been well received, and he's had a number of offers of publication lately. Finally, Jesse works with homeless and addiction communities in Toronto, Canada, as he himself is a recovering addict who spent many years trapped in the revolving door that many find themselves in, of homelessness, addiction, and incarceration, which are all products of this colonial trauma and how they manifest in his own life. So I'm delighted to bring Jesse into the panel and take it away from here.
Hi, my name is Jesse Thistle. I'm here on the traditional territory, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Anishinaabe peoples, before them, as well as Haudenosaunee, Métis Nation of Ontario, Wendat, and like Victoria said, 12,000 years of history before. So I'd just like to honor that. I'd also like to say that Victoria, I took a class of hers last year, and she really advocated and helped me rediscover my history. And for me, that was a catalyst to attach myself, my biography, my life, to colonialism. She had a specific question that asked people to situate themselves in colonialism. So I'll start with my biographical story and then connect it to the larger policies. Jail and the streets was where my resentments toward my parents, my culture, and my lot in life ultimately cast me. It was 2006. I was 138 pounds and incarcerated at Maplehurst Jail in Milton, Ontario at 6'2". I looked like a walking skeleton. After more than 11 years, 11 homeless years in the streets, I eroded my health. My leg was infected with gangrene. They wanted to amputate it after a failed surgery and poor health from living on the streets. My mind was shattered, and my spirit was a shadow of my former self. And there was something that I used to think about in jail that always kind of haunted me. It was something that my grandfather had told me when I was 3 years old. My Métis Cree grandfather had told me before he placed my brothers and me into adoption in 1979. He said, "Don't tell them you're Métis or they'll hang you." And I didn't understand what that meant at the time. When we were in children's aid there, there were thoughts of breaking us up, but my paternal Métis Scott grandparents stepped in it, and they took us, and that's how I ended up here in Toronto. The destruction of my nuclear family was just one of the most recent ripples in an ocean of colonial trauma suffered by my family, Métis from northern Saskatchewan. My grandfather's cautious goodbye underscored that ugly truth in my family's history. I eventually came to understand his fear for wars, but I didn't know that I was succumbing to my own fear. That's why I was on the streets for all those years, trapped and addicted in the revolving door of crime and incarceration. Eventually I got clean and found my way to university, and that's where I met Victoria, and she encouraged her class while I was in it to start to dig into the archive of our family's past and place this within the context of colonialism. My first year was really tough in school. I worked the steps of AA, trying to remain sober, but they didn't dig deep enough within my soul to relieve, as Lee Miracle has quoted, the systemic rage that is with a lot of Indigenous youth and young people. It had been with me since childhood. I didn't know what it was or where it had come from, and I knew that if I didn't get rid of it, that one day that I'd be back on the streets using. So I decided to try something radical. to prevent relapsing, I combined AA's principles with historical research. Step 4 of AA clearly states that one must compile an extensive moral inventory of one's past actions. The moral inventory is pivotal to long-term recovery because it provides understanding of illogical and hurtful addiction behavior that is otherwise incomprehensible. Understanding in turn helps addicts come to terms with their past, allowing for personal forgiveness, which sets the stage for later amendment making and finally liberation from addiction. Instead, in my second year at York, instead of starting on the 4th step principle on myself, I got the idea to place that template over my family's genealogy, my Aboriginal history, and try to understand where this historical trauma that I was experiencing in my life, what was the source of it. And for me, I traced it back to the 1885 resistance at Batoche in Saskatchewan. When I did that, I could see that my parents' decision to let me and my brothers go into adoption was part of a long historical trend, and their actions made sense in that context. And when I came to understand why they had acted the way they did, I came to forgive my mom and my dad. So to begin historically, you really have to rewind it back to 1670. The HBC charter granted by, I think it's King James II of England, to the HBC to trade within the Hudson's Bay. A lot of men from Europe were coming in, and they were to access the fur within North America, marrying into indigenous trading networks through females, female indigenous people. So the patronym of my people's legacy comes from European fathers and indigenous women. This continued on. There was also French men who came up from the south and did the same thing through the Northwest Company up till 1821, sorry. And over time, an ethnogenesis occurred that created the Métis people. After 1821, we had a golden period up until 1869 with the transference of the Hudson's Bay drainage area to the Dominion of Canada. Now, this was an unconsulted transfer of Métis and Aboriginal land to the Dominion of Canada, and the Métis people, my ancestors, they stood up and they won the Red River Resistance led by Louis Riel, a cousin of mine. And it forced Canada to admit Manitoba into Confederation with the Manitoba Act of May 12, 1870. The act infuriated the then Prime Minister Macdonald from the beginning. It recognized Métis land claims and settlement by granting them official homeland of their own, the province of Manitoba. Section 31 of the Manitoba Act clearly lays this out. Quote, and whereas it is expedient toward the extinguishment of Indian land title to the lands in the province of Manitoba to appreciate a portion of such ungranted lands to the extent of 1,400,000 acres thereof for the benefit and families of the half-breed residents, end quote. However, the Act's half-breed land claim stipulation was purposely obstructed by Sir John A. Macdonald the moment the ink dried. Macdonald's real desire to sabotage Métis land claims in Manitoba can be heard in an official letter he wrote to John Rose dated February 23, 1870. Quote, these impulsive half-breeds have got spoiled in their immute, the Red River Resistance, and must be kept down by a strong hand until they are swamped by the influx of settlers. End quote. Macdonald, he went about swamping the Métis by he didn't set up a land claims commission for the Métis until 1872, while he underhandedly promoted aggressive settler Canadian land speculation across Manitoba. This meant that by 1872, most of the Red River settlement was already taken. So my ancestors had to move from Manitoba to Batoche, and by 1885, more land speculators had come out, and they started surveying the land there. So not trusting what the government had already done to them in Manitoba, they rose up and fought against the government. For me, this when I found out that why my people had risen up and fought against the Canadian government and how that affected me, because I had traced it through genealogical charts, I could see that subsequent generations after my great-grandparents had fought, the Canadian government had systematically tried to disperse the Métis so that they couldn't rise up again. When that happened, the government had the Prairie Removal Act in the 1930s under the CCF government, where they placed Métis on colonies across Saskatchewan. Some of them, my relatives, they hid them in reservations. Some fled north to the Parkland Belt. Some fled south to Montana and as far east as Abitibi, Ontario. So when I understood all this trauma that was being passed down to me, I could see why I had ended up in jail. I could see my whole history. I could see my final scene, which made no sense before I knew my history of my movie. When I looked at the whole history of my people, my movie made sense. And I think that's important for people, settler and Indigenous, to understand that this hiding of the true colonial history of Canada is really harmful to Indigenous people, because it takes them away from being able to see what is happening to them, and it also makes settlers complicit in the wholesale destruction of a people for land and resource allocation. The point of my story is not to accuse, right? It's for people to understand that this is happening, and that by turning a blind eye or not trying to investigate, you're really playing into the colonial apparatus that has come to take land and injure Indigenous people, you know. So the main thing is, I think, as settlers, is to create a platform to help people, Indigenous peoples, to reconnect with their history, to understand their present situation. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust, he said that man can understand, can endure anyhow when he knows why. It's not knowing that history. You're not allowing people to understand why things are happening. You need to help them connect to that history, and in turn that will help liberate the people. Like within my family, when I told them this, to where I'm from in Saskatchewan, to the people that I come from, my mom, she got sober and she just graduated college 2 weeks ago. My brother, he's gotten out from a community ordered psychiatric treatment. He's on his own. So there's real results that are happening from reconnecting my family to our history. And I think that that's the main message that I'm trying to get across, is that we need to make it available so people can understand, so they can move forward together, right? So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. Thanks for sharing a little bit of your story with us, and so nicely weaving it into some of these pieces that we've been talking about, and just being really open with the impacts that it's been on you. And I know for me, what I'm taking away from this is that recognition that, yeah, this hiding, or this trying to ignore, or this looking away from our history not only has impacts in the way that we continue to perpetuate colonialism as like a big system or structure, but what you did for me was bring it down to a really tangible individual level, and show the impact on Indigenous folks who also in many ways have been disconnected, and why that is probably also systemic and something that the system of colonialism would want to continue. So thank you so much for being here. Again, if folks do have questions, we will have a little bit of time at the end, so you can tweet #skills4solidarity or email skillsforsolidarity@leadnow.ca. We've got a few great ones lined up, but we might be able to fit in a couple more, so send them our way. And we have one more panelist tonight before we get into that piece. So Our last panelist is Ed Bianchi. So Ed has been the Kairos program manager since 2012. And prior to that, starting in 2001, he coordinated Kairos's Indigenous rights program, working with Indigenous peoples and their allies on innovative public education and action initiatives in Canada and internationally, really towards the recognition and enforcement of Indigenous peoples' rights. Kairos's creation in 2001 brought together 10 formerly separate social justice coalitions, including the Aboriginal Rights Coalition, which is a coalition of churches, church organizations, Indigenous peoples, and regional groups. And Ed was the national coordinator of this from 1995 to 2001. He also co-founded Friends of the Lubicon in 1986, and this is a Toronto-based support group for the Lubicon Cree First Nation in Alberta. He might speak a little bit more about that, but they launched an international boycott of the Daishawa Paper Manufacturing Company in 1991, and it was so successful that the company actually sued them, and in 98, the Ontario Court of Appeals ruled that the boycott was in fact legal, an example of how information campaigns should be conducted in a democratic society. So I will hand it over to Ed to wrap up our panels this evening, and then we'll jump into the Q&A after that.
Thanks very much, Anna. Really appreciate that gracious introduction. I also want to thank the panelists for their words. It's a privilege to be here with you, and it's an honor actually to be here with you and to be part of this process. It's a bit intimidating actually to follow in your footsteps, big shoes to fill, but I'll do my best, and perhaps the best thing I can do is keep my comments short. As Anna said, my name is Ed Bianchi, and I'm coming to you from Ottawa, Ontario, Algonquin territory. I've lived here for about I guess well 10 years, and before that I lived in Toronto, but I'm actually from British Columbia, a small place called Trail, British Columbia, which is very close to the border, the U.S. border. And I grew up, my parents immigrated from Italy in the late 50s. So I'm at the other end of the spectrum from Victoria. My family is very, very newcomers. And in fact, my parents moved back to Italy after my dad retired. So I guess in some ways we're the best kind of settlers. We went back home. I'm still here, however, and I've been privileged. I've had a privileged life, to work so closely with Indigenous peoples in Canada for so long. And what I wanted to focus on a little bit is something that was touched on by the other panelists. In essence, the importance of education in the process of decolonization. And at Kairos, what we try and do is focus on helping people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, understand the history that Rubina, Jesse, and Victoria all touched on. And Jesse, your comments were very profound, because we've seen that happen with our own educational initiatives. We've seen how helping people to understand their history can be transformative and can be powerful. And this is true for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. We do this mostly through an exercise called the blanket exercise, which is something that the churches developed in the late 90s with the help of Indigenous peoples. It was in response to the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and it was a way to try and keep the major themes and recommendations of the Commission alive. And as I'm sure that some of your listeners know, the report of the Royal Commission was 4,000 pages, and more than half of that was history, because as we've been saying this evening, what the Commission has realized that we can't address the challenges that we're facing today unless we understand how we got to where we are. And so what we did was we developed this exercise that builds on the pedagogy, the methodology of people like Paulo Freire, who believe that if you involve a person's body, mind, and spirit in the learning process, then not only is that learning more profound, but it's also more meaningful and more lasting. So what happens with the blanket exercise, as you can imagine, is that we use blankets to represent the land, to represent Canada, and the participants represent the First Nations, Inuit, and later Métis peoples of Canada. And there's a script, and we go through the script. And the script mentions the things that we've talked about this evening. It mentions the Indian Act. It mentions the violence against Indigenous women. It mentions the 60s scoop. It mentions the residential schools. But it even goes a little bit further back and talks about the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, the idea that the Europeans justified their occupation of North America or Turtle Island through this theory that since there wasn't anybody living there, they could just claim it. Of course, when they realized that there were people living there, they conveniently adjusted that theory to the land not being occupied by civilized people or not being put to civilized use. And of course, they were the ones who defined what civilized meant. So as we take people through this history, as we ask them to participate in the story by reading certain scrolls that have like parts of that history, as we make the blanket smaller and smaller to represent the dispossession of the land, the displacement of the land, as we give them cards and ask them to step off the blankets because they represent those people who died from diseases that were introduced by the Europeans, as we ask them to step off the blankets because they're holding cards that represent those people who died from malnutrition or who died because they were displaced and put onto lands that they weren't familiar with, or who were displaced or killed during the Métis rebellion, or if they were Inuit people who were moved to areas where they couldn't hunt or fish. As they're asked to do these things, they have an experience which over and over again that we've seen, and we've been doing this exercise since 1997, they feel a tiny, tiny bit of what it's like to have experienced that. And I'm always amazed at how responsive people are to that and how it helps them to at least get started on trying to get a grasp of this history that is our history. Jesse, your story reminded me of an exercise I did once with some young First Nations youth. And after the exercise, one of the young men came up to me and said, because now I understand, he said, this isn't about me. He said, this is about the land. They wanted the land, and they came and took the land, and they didn't care what happened to us. And those kinds of experiences are over and over again. What we do with the blanket exercise is that we encourage people to, afterwards, after they've completed the exercise, we encourage them to talk about it, to debrief. We encourage them to, if possible, invite an elder or an Aboriginal person from their community or from near where they live. Getting to Victoria's point about learning about your area. We found that doing that enriches the experience because it provides people with an opportunity to make those initial relationships. And that's what I wanted to emphasize too, is that this process of decolonization, this process of learning our history, our shared history, it's a very personal process, either personal individually or personal in terms of how we build our relationships, and it's one by one. I was at an event in Toronto just recently where it was a representative from the churches the churches that form Kairos. And we were talking about what are we going to do now that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is coming to an end? What are we going to do next? And we talked about all the things that we're doing and talked about all the things that we might do. And there was an elder there, and she said, I think you guys have to understand that whatever it is that you're doing, it's going to be one-on-one and one at a time. And it's going to have to focus on relationship building in order to build the kind of trust that you need to really begin to grasp that shared history that is so important to the whole process of decolonization. So I think I'll stop there now, because I know that there is probably millions of people who want to ask questions, and I don't want to take up any more time. But I just want to thank all of you once again for your contributions, and to again underline the fact that it's a privilege and an honor to be with you here this evening.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that, Ed. I'd love to. That's the first I'd heard of the blanket exercise, though you told me a little bit about it. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about the resource, and if it's possible to make stuff like that available to folks who are watching, we can post it on the website, or even little bits and pieces of it that might be useful. That would be wonderful. So maybe we can follow up afterwards. And you're right, we do have some really great questions. So we have about 20 minutes left to dive into as many of them as we can. I'm going to start with something that's come up through quite a number of folks' questions. So Chris on Twitter, and Molly in the inbox, and Adrian all asked questions around how to find out details about your history. So I think this is directed mostly to Victoria and Jesse, but of course anyone free to respond. So Molly mentioned that they've read in Distant Relations a couple years ago and want to take on a similar project, and are there any tips that you might have, or do you know where to find others who might currently be writing their own family history with a decolonizing lens? And then Adrian tapping into researching her personal history since the 1700s, which has First Nations and Métis heritage, running into roadblocks on how to dig deeper, and it's proven difficult to understand the history. And then, yeah, Chris just asking on any pointers on where to uncover local colonial histories, especially outside of some of our large urban centers. So Jesse or Victoria, if you have any thoughts on that, folks are really keen to engage in a similar project to what you've been up to. So whichever one of you would like to jump in first.
Okay, I'll start. I'll say Ancestry.com obviously is a place to start for genealogy, just trying to find your own family tree. It is not always possible. Some people, for example, a lot of Jewish people lost a lot of relatives and a lot of records, and there have been all kinds of situations where records have been destroyed. I'm going to speak about the non-Indigenous part of it. Maybe Jesse can speak more about researching Indigenous family history. One thing I found really useful was, once I had at least some of the family names and the names of individuals, was to look at old town histories. Again, look locally. And just go into the indexes of books, even history books, and see if you see any of those names, and then see what you can build up from that. That's how I found out often what my ancestors' initial relationships were and interactions were with Indigenous peoples in particular territories. If you can find out from their birth and death records or their marriage records where your ancestors were living, and then looking up the histories of those places. There are also land records. Sometimes you can find letters or diaries in your family history. It is a little bit like looking at, for needles in haystacks. You have to do a lot of sifting. Anyway, I'll let Jesse say something too.
For me, I had to buy a big pouch of tobacco and go around to all the elders. That's where I started, and I gave and asked if they would help me in my search. I started with my immediate family, and again, like Victoria was saying, Ancestry.com gave me the bones. It was kind of a navigational tool that I used. to step back in time. I also got really lucky because I wrote an essay that caught the attention of Victoria, and she kicked it up to a specialist in Métis history who knew my family history, and she's Dr. Carolyn Pedrucci at York University, and she helped me trace back and build an extensive family tree. But I want to remind everybody that religion was a big deal back in the day, and Oblates and Jesuits, they all kept really great records, and that's how I found a lot of my really old history past 1800 was through the church. And a lot of times records just don't exist that are that old. For Métis in particular, you have to go through fur trade records. There's the Northwest Company records at McGill. There's also HBC records that are online. There's yeah, so you just have to peck, and like Victoria said, it's a long process of unearthing your family's history, but it doesn't come at once. It comes in little grains here and there. So be patient. Something that you might think is insignificant is actually very significant, and follow all leads. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thanks. And if other folks have tips on this, maybe there's people who are watching who have done their own exploration of their history, post that on the forum. Let us know what challenges you've encountered, what resources you found, what's worked, because I think, and there's also some great questions that some of our panelists have outlined in the workbook that can help us start digging into this. And I think Victoria is the one that provided those, and Jesse, I imagine some of those maybe provided the framework for some of the work that you've been done. So there's ways to start working on this. The next question is for Robina. So you mentioned that until recently the government intentionally shaped the Indian Act to cause women to lose their status. Can you expand on this? How do you know this was done intentionally?
Well, I guess I'm, making a big blanket statement when I say it was done intentionally. I would just assume it was when you look at the development of the Indian Act. I just can't imagine why didn't they say men as opposed to women would lose their status, but they did decide on women. And through the women losing their status, then so did their children. And so when you're looking at policies of assimilation, to me it would be logical that you would look at the givers of life, which would be the women. And that continued until 1985 when the Indian Act was changed, and that's when Bill C-31 came out. And women who had lost their status could then reapply to have their status reinstated, which is not an easy process, but women did, but not all the women that were eligible did apply to have their status reinstated. But as well, it kicked it down a few generations, so they haven't completely rid the Indian Act of this inequality. And will they ever? I probably doubt it. And so I'm not sure whether I can say much more about that. Thanks.
Awesome, thanks, Robina. And just going back a little bit to the last question we asked, this would be open to any of you to comment on, but folks are asking not only how to get more information about your own personal history, but also more information about the land that you're living on. So we've talked a lot tonight about starting there, starting local. And so if any of you have suggestions on good starting places for getting to know the history of the land that you are on, that would also be really appreciated. I'll just throw that out to all of you if anyone wants to jump in and respond. Victoria, awesome.
There's several things you can do. I mean, you can start, I think you have to follow two lines of research. One is sort of the published archival academic stream, but the other one is associating with Indigenous people in the area and learning the history of the area from their perspective. I think that's really crucial because you will learn things that you won't learn just from history books. So I think you have to take a double approach to the research. In terms of written history, you obviously have to be very careful about who you're reading. because there are a lot of historians who have reinforced colonial perspectives, and so that it's tricky to find good historical analysis of at a regional level. You can look at provincial histories. You can look at for historians who also work with Indigenous people. If they're non-Indigenous, there are also more and more Indigenous historians. Check out their work. Those are places to start. There are also archives, local archives for wherever you are. They can be very very small archives or huge archives, like in Toronto. See if there are any books published. See if there's a museum, and then you have to kind of read a lot of these things against the grain, because some, like museums, often displays may not reflect Indigenous perspectives, and you have to look critically.
For sure. Thanks, Victoria. Rubina, did you have anything to add to that one?
Well, I was just thinking, in most communities, there's friendship centers. I know in Victoria we have the Greater Victoria School District Aboriginal Nations Education Division. They have a wealth of knowledge in their library. In Victoria we have the BC Association of Friendship Centers, and I also think about at the university. So if you're in, again, Victoria, and every university has their own place, but like we have the First People's House, it's a good place to just contact those people and ask them. And I think often elders, if you know elders or can be put in touch with elders have so much to say, and a really wonderful way of wanting to share this history. And I think that they're a really good place to start and direct you in a good way to get a good start on collecting this kind of information. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks to both of you. So our next question comes from Helena. I'm not going to try and pronounce your last name, apologies, but this came to us through the inbox, and again, it's to any of our panelists, and a bit of a different tack than what we've been talking about in the panel specifically, but I think really relevant. So the question is that given that currently the Indigenous people in Palestine are being aggressively persecuted and have been experiencing settler colonialism for over 60 years, she'd love to hear thoughts from any of you on how to be in solidarity with other Indigenous populations who are also being oppressed worldwide. So what does it look like to not only connect to what's happening here on this land, but also to be in solidarity internationally, and how are all of these issues connected? So Ed, yeah, I'd love to hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Actually, I was gonna just add to the last question, but I can tackle both.
Sorry, I missed. Sure, that would be great.
That's okay. Just to pick up on what Victoria and Rubina were saying, in Ottawa, Kairos has worked with Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations to organize an annual event, which we call Covenant Chain Link, in honor of the historical treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Europeans. But it's a deliberate attempt to try and bring together Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in general, but in particular educators in the Ottawa area, specifically for the reason that we were talking about. I mean, because there are lots of, for example, teachers in the Ottawa area who are looking to try and raise awareness and understanding of Indigenous rights issues with their students. But they often have a hard time, knowing who to go and speak to. So in Ottawa, what we tried to do is create a space for those people to come together and make those kind of connections so that they can carry on those relationships. With regards to the Israel-Palestine and solidarity, it reminds me of a quote by an Australian Aborigine, a woman, Lila Watson, and I'll paraphrase because I don't remember the exact wording, but she said, if you've come to help me, then you're wasting your time, but if you come because your liberation is bound up in mind, and let us work together. And I think what we need to do is we need to see how colonialism and colonization unfolds all over the world in different ways, and to recognize it for what it is, and to try and make those kind of links and connections, and identify the similarities, and identify the shared histories, internationally, that have created the similar challenges in different parts of the world. So I think, again, education, awareness, making ourselves more aware of those common ground, I think, is really important.
Did anyone else have anything to add, or should we might have time for one more question?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thanks for that, Ed. Yeah, I think also, just in quick response, often in some urban centers I've seen there have been conversations, lots with the title, like From Turtle Island to Palestine, what does it look like to be in solidarity across Indigenous populations? So I just there are events happening that are bringing together communities internationally that are affected by colonialism, so be on the lookout for those. I'm just going to ask one final question. This one referring back to something you mentioned, Robina, earlier in your talk. This question is from Lily, and she sent it via Twitter, and it says, what does the top of that mountain that you were talking about look like that we're trying to climb up? So where does this work of anti-oppression find a plateau? So what does the top of that mountain look like? How do we get there?
I think the top of that mountain is some of what we're talking around this whole process of decolonization. But what it means is, I think about my friend when we were starting university, and saying one of the things they said is that the hardest thing for us is that we always feel like we're starting at zero, and so every time we went into a classroom, we'd have to explain everything about what it means to be Indigenous, what I could talk about, what I couldn't. I was always saying, I'm only speaking for myself, and I was always trying to explain in 2 minutes or 3 minutes something about what it means to be Indigenous and what maybe was a little bit different. And so for me, being at the top of the mountain is that we would be talking about justice for all people. We would be talking about working across all differences. Children would be safe when children needed to be protected, because I think there's times when children still need to be protected. We would know that they would be safe wherever they went to. It would mean that education was available to all. It would mean all of those things. It would mean that we were in a just society.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ramita. So we're very close to the top of the hour here, so we are going to wrap. But I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone for joining us tonight and for participating in this conversation. The date for the next panel isn't quite confirmed yet, but if you keep looking on the announcements page on the Skills for Solidarity website, you'll find out, and we'll send you emails. So there'll be multiple ways to find out what is coming next. Again, if you have questions or feedback, please send them our way. We're trying to integrate as much of what we're hearing from you as we can moving forward. So skillsforsolidarity@leadnow.ca is the email address to send to. And if you know other folks who are still keen to join us but missed out, just let them know, yep, the panels will be available online pretty much right afterwards, so they can catch up and join us at the next one. Also, just a note to folks that the program that we're running right now is funded by small donations by our community. So if you're finding Skills for Solidarity interesting and want to support Leadnow's ability to provide opportunities like this in the future, I just encourage you, if you can, to make a small contribution at Leadnow.ca/donate. Whatever you can afford would be great. And I just want to leave us tonight with one of the questions that Rabina has put in the module workbook this time around. She says, Thomas King reminds us at the end of a chapter in his book, The Truth About Stories. So now you've heard the story, do what you wish with it, but in 10 or 20 years from now, do not say you would have lived your life differently if only you had known the story. So now we're starting, each of us who's participating in this program, to get a little bit of a broader understanding of the story going on this land, a paragraph or two, a snippet from our panelists, and we're just putting it out to you. How are you going to learn the rest? Because there's so much more for us to keep doing on this journey. So thanks for joining us again. and for continuing with us this summer. We'll be in touch soon. Again, check out the announcements page. There's lots of cool initiatives that I want to be posting on over the next couple weeks to let people know about. So keep looking. I'd love to have you reading. And if you have things that are exciting going on in your community that you'd like me to post about, then send me an email as well. I'd be happy to do that. Huge, huge thank you to our panelists for all of what you shared with us tonight, your stories, your vulnerability, your analysis. It's been so valuable to have all of you here this evening, and a real delight to have you join us. So massive thank you to you and to everyone else. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope that we see you all next time. Good night.